Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's edition to the Canadian Tree Fund webinar series, which aims to bring relevant topics in arboriculture and urban forestry to Canadian arborists. Today's presentation is Woodbanks, Fuel Poverty in Urban Forestry, Exploring the Relationship. Our presenters today are Rick Harper, Clarisse Hart, and Eric Griffith. The Canadian Tree Fund extends a big thank you to our presenters for joining us here today, and we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Alex. It's good to see everybody. I just wanted to go through a couple brief things before I turn it over to my partners in crime here, Clarisse Hart and Dr. Eric Griffith. I wanted to, of course, welcome the folks that typically attend the Canadian Tree Fund broadcasts. I also wanted to welcome anyone that attends our monthly Urban Forestry Today webcast. We also tried to get the word out on those channels as well. So big time welcome to the Urban Forestry Today attendees that attend our typical monthly broadcasts. And really, I wanted to sort of just take a quick moment here at the very beginning to acknowledge the hard work that Clarisse and other folks have done related to Woodbanks. This really is a project that sort of came from a lot of hard work and a lot of inspiration from Clarisse herself. Clarisse and I actually met whenever she was taking classes at the University of Massachusetts. And this really arose from an informal discussion between herself and me. And so we involved Dr. Jay Dampier from the University of Wisconsin, who has some natural resource training as well as some social science training like myself. And then, of course, Dr. Eric Griffith, who we're going to hear from as well today, social scientist. He's down at Duke University. So it's so fantastic to not only be here to be speaking to my fellow Canadians, but also to welcome two great collaborators and friends. We're going to turn it over to you, Clarisse. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Rick, and thanks for being Canadian, because I really have no credibility in that area here. So I'm Clarisse Hart, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Education and Outreach here at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts, which is on traditional Nipmuc land. And I'm going to be co-presenting here with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Eric Griffith. I'll be talking first, and then I'll turn it over to Eric. And we aren't joined today by Jay Dampier, but he has been Jay has been just a really important collaborator in this work, so we want to acknowledge and thank him. We made the slides accessible to download, so that should be in the chat, or you can just type in the URL directly from the slides. So please just, I think the chat is being monitored, so let us know if you have trouble accessing them. You don't have to access them, we'll be sharing them, but if you'd like to have them, you're welcome to. So first, we definitely want to thank many folks. And first and foremost, we want to thank the Indigenous people whose homelands are the site of these natural resources and these communities that we are talking about. I work closely with Indigenous nations here, and we absolutely honor the millennia of Indigenous stewardship that created the abundance that we have today, that shaped the land, the resources that are surrounding us today. And we're actively working in community with Indigenous nations to make sure that these lands, these resources are accessible and affirming and sustaining for the peoples of those lands. So if you want to just type in the chat, I don't know if the chat is muted or if we'll be able to see what you're saying, but if you want to type in the chat the Indigenous homeland that you are joining from, I would love to know. That gives us a sense of kind of the range of folks who are here. And it's also a way of just acknowledging and thanking the people of those lands. We also want to thank a long list of people who have helped us not only with the specific research that we'll be talking to you about today, but also just generally making Woodbanks into something that are accessible and widespread. There are thousands of people who are working tirelessly to make Woodbanks a reality. So thank you to all of those people. All right, so what is a woodbank? I'm not sure if we'll be able to see the chat. So you can type into the chat if you want to say what you feel like is a woodbank, or you can just think about it independently. Maybe you've heard of them. Maybe you work on a woodbank. Maybe you have benefited from a woodbank. But what kind of comes to mind, and I'm going to share the definition, the formal definition in a second. All right, so the definition that we work with is that it is a local community-based initiative where firewood is collected, processed, and distributed to fuel poor households. I'm going to break that down into a few slides because there's a lot of depth in each of these lines. And this definition comes from Sabrina Vivian and Jessica Leahy. Dr. Leahy is at the University of Maine. She was sort of the first person ever to do wood bank research, and she really did it geographically based in Maine. And then our team has spread it to the US, that research, and hopefully we can get some North American research going soon. So we see a picture here of a wood bank in action in Norwich, Vermont. And you can see that it's often just a bunch of regular looking folks. Some of them have PPE and they're working with fancy chainsaws and equipment. But a lot of times it's just some volunteers who are getting together to split and stack some wood. So let's talk about where these are. Whoops. The computer's a little bit laggy, sorry. Did I just go back 2 slides or 1 slide? Okay, so these are initiatives that occur across a range of climate zones, which is very relevant to Canada because you guys have a really big range of climate zones as well, and we just want to articulate that they're very successful across many different climate zones. Pretty much where you have trees, these can be possible, and they definitely exist across a range of rural to urban areas, although they're more prevalent in rural areas. And to make a wood bank go, firewood gets collected in some way, processed in some way, and distributed in some way. And I mention in some way because in the 80+ wood banks that you saw on that map, everybody seems to do it just a little bit differently. There are some commonalities that we've been pulling together as researchers, but it's very localized to what works for each community. So here we have some folks it's called like the Society of Red Suspenders in Salem, Oregon. So if you volunteer for long enough, then you earn your red suspenders in this group, which is a church-based group. And you can see that they're working, in Salem, Oregon with big old trees, and they have some sawyers, they have volunteers who just do the splitting. You can see a young person there in the back. They are mostly working with wood that has been donated to them or sort of utilized by them from tree care companies. So it's sort of like, where do we dump this wood that we've just taken down a tree or trees at someone's property? They bring it to the wood bank and then it gets processed. If we look down to Petersham, Massachusetts, which is I'll talk about in a minute because this is where I live. This is sort of my heart. This is my team of folks here. We typically work with our highway department and the municipality and the electric company. Those are the people that are giving us the wood that we are splitting and stacking for communities. And we work with a lot of volunteers from the local universities, including the University of Massachusetts, where Rick is based. And then over here on the right, we have Huntingdown, Maryland, and their wood comes from a lot of different sources. So basically an all of the above approach, including like real estate clearing. And they distribute, you can see, with pickup trucks, whereas in Petersham, people come with their cars and they fill up their cars at the transfer station. And then in the top left, the Salem, Oregon people, they do a combination of pickup and delivery. So again, like this collection, processing, and distribution happens really differently across the range of wood banks. And then the last thing I want to share is this one in Salem, Missouri, which they just kind of get wood when and where they can, and they stack it with a sign outside of their church. And it's like, please take only what you need. And so sometimes the wood stays for a long time, sometimes the wood all goes, just based on kind of community need. So that one's a little bit more ad hoc. And then fuel poverty. I'm going to dig into this a little bit because this is a really important topic and something that will be interesting for you guys to think about from the Canadian perspective. So fuel poor households, what does that mean? Well, fuel poverty, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, but places where, okay, so I'll start with natural resource dependent areas. So these are places where a natural resource kind of accounts for a lot of the economy or brings a lot of population in. And then fuel poverty is often really connected to having an income that's below the poverty line. So in the US, more than half of the households that are below the poverty line, more than half of them are fuel poor, so have fuel insecurity. And so here's a family in Greene County, Tennessee, which is both a natural resource dependent area and has a lot of fuel poverty. And this is a wood bank delivering wood at a person's house. So in the northeastern US, and again, I'm sorry, there's so many US figures, but that's what we have, it's what we know here. In the northeastern US, 20% of households use wood as a primary energy source. So that's a large number of people who could be running into some emergency need issues, which we'll talk about. And then there's a pretty high percentage, surprisingly high percentage of people who use wood as a primary heating source. So in the US, 3% of US households rely on firewood as a primary heating source, which is a 59% increase since 2001. And there's an additional 7.8% or 9.2 million households that rely on firewood as a secondary source of heating fuel. So suddenly we have quite a large number of people who are using wood primarily for their heat and are dealing with poverty at the same time. And so that really illuminates the need for a wood bank. In Canada, thank you to Eric for pulling together some figures. 6.5% of Canadian households use wood as a primary heating source, and this figure doubled between 1990 and 2010. We don't have figures on how many people use it as a secondary heating source, but we can assume based on the US that there's probably a doubling or maybe even a tripling of the number of households if you kind of lump them all together as people who you potentially use wood as a heating source. So the origins of this research project. In 2015, the town of Petersham, which is where I live, which is a small little town of 1,000 people, we wanted to start a wood bank called my colleagues Sean Mahoney and Melissa Levangie, who Melissa Levangie is really active in ISA here in the US. We knew that there was some fuel poverty in our town. We also knew that we had an increasing amount of downed wood, mostly from extreme storms, but also from the approach of emerald ash borer. Suddenly the utility company was taking down a bunch of ash trees and we needed to use them. So we wanted to learn from other people who had started wood banks. So we went to Dr. Jess Leahy and talked to her. She's done some published work, which is linked in this slide, and you'll be able to access that if you need to. And what I learned from Jess is that, like, of the wood banks that she had been looking at regionally in Maine and New Hampshire, there was a wide range of sort of how people did things. And then I started to think, well, I bet there's a really wide range nationally. Are there other wood banks nationally? And then I started to talk to some wood banks regionally, and I asked them, like, have you learned from other parts of the country? Where do you kind of learn from? And it seems like kind of one at a time, they learn from one or two other wood banks. So almost everyone was operating in isolation and not understanding that there actually were wood banks in the Pacific Northwest. There were wood banks in Montana. There are wood banks in the Southeast and in the Southwest. And they're all kind of reinventing the wheel again and again and again. And I think that's a good thing in part because it does allow you to really create a resource system that works very locally. But there were a lot of lessons that could be shared. So I then interviewed 20 plus wood banks around the country, and I published an article in the Tree Care Industry Association magazine because at that time I knew I was going to be presenting at their national conference to talk to tree care industry folks about how they could get involved in wood banks. And around that same time, I was taking a class at UMass, a community forestry class with Rick Harper, who spoke to you at the beginning of this talk. We were outside of Bertucci's restaurant, which is like a chain, I don't know. And I was like, oh, I'm doing this project. And he said, what? That sounds like a research project. So then he connected me with Jay and Eric, and suddenly we're this research community thinking about how we can understand wood banks across scale, how we can maybe be a little predictive about where wood banks could work well when they don't exist now. So that was our work. And so you see the little Petersham wood bank starting there in the top right in 2015 with, I think it was like 7 of us that would show up. And then we grew. So as you kind of work down, you see a larger number of people, maybe a little more organization. We have like some pallets for stacking. And then we started to write grants and we got some equipment donated. So we have an old fire truck, pickup truck, and now we have a wood processor. And we've been working with Sean Mahoney, who's from the state of Massachusetts, who created a grant program for the whole state of Massachusetts where they can apply for small grants. And we built these really fantastic wood crates for drying. We got more equipment for sort of assessing how dry the wood was. And all the while we were doing lots of fundraising ourselves. So you see a group of ladies there who have all been sewing kindling bags that we sold at the country store as a fundraiser for the project. So all the groups that do wood banks have to have some kind of funding source. So you'll in paper number 2 probably you'll start to see some of the ways that people can fund their initiatives and how much money it takes to get these going. Really, when we started, it was just like some really talented people who were good sawyers, had chainsaws, had PPE, and Harvard Forest loaned us a really old splitter from like 1972, I'm pretty sure, and it was really slow. But we gave out, 3 cords of wood that year, and I think this year this past year we did 15. So the need is absolutely there, and as soon as you start to meet that need and the word gets out, then the demand really explodes. So here's a couple of articles. Here's the one that I wrote in 2016, and then an article that came out in 2020 that interviewed us, but really does a lot more kind of national coverage. So dig into the research project. I'll talk for another 5 minutes and I'll hand it off to Eric. So I did a really deep internet search for the locations of existing wood banks, which was exciting because wood banks go by a lot of different names, it turns out. So they're not just called wood banks. Sometimes they're called charity cuts. They're called firewood ministries. They're called so many different things. So I found 82, I think, that way, which is the map that you saw before. That is definitely an ever-evolving map. I have a Harvard student, Anissa Prasad, who's working on the map right now, and she's already found, I think, 30 plus new ones. And of course, since 2016, some of the existing wood banks have closed for whatever reason. So it's an ever-evolving map for sure. When I did my phone interviews, it was a semi-structured phone interview, meaning I had a pretty set script of questions, or at least topics that I wanted to cover, but it allowed for some real back and forth. So we got some really rich data from a lot of different geographic areas and types of wood bank operations. So we ended up with 3 basic research questions. Where do wood banks operate? What is the organizational structure of wood banks? And who is accessing those wood banks? So where do wood banks operate? We assumed that it would be in places with high wood burning and high poverty. And part of that assumption, part of that hypothesis was based on the work that Dr. Leahy did with her student, Sabrina, just looking at one county in Maine, thinking about potential wood bank demand. And they had similar kind of assumptions about high wood burning, high poverty, and levels of forest cover. But it turns out that it's actually way more varied. So I'm going to let Eric jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the map that Eric created shows kind of spatially the counties where you would expect, so it's the dark areas, the counties where you would expect wood banks to be based on, these are places with high wood burning and high poverty. But then you see that the wood banks actually exist outside of those spaces sometimes. So we have some thoughts about why that is. And I'll tell you that, like, my own thought on that is that in a place that's just strapped all the time and has no bandwidth for doing anything but living, it's going to be harder to get a wood bank operating. But what you'll find is that a lot of wood banks are either operating at the county level or multiple town levels, so that you can have this sort of combination of means. So like people who do have the time and the money to donate, to volunteer, and then creating that sort of community effort that can really wrap around the communities of need. So just a little more information there. 20% of wood banks operate in these kind of hypothesized high demand counties, but 35% of wood banks operate in counties that are neither high in firewood use nor in poverty. So again, like there's definitely a disconnect between areas where you would expect it just sort of based on what we hypothesized would be the demand and where they actually operate. And I think what you take away from that is that need is everywhere. You know, you can have a county average for things, but there's need everywhere. And then just in terms of the ones even that I interviewed, like only a third of those wood banks met or exceeded the county firewood dependency and poverty mapping thresholds. So again, we talked to a range of folks and we saw a range of need, but the need is always there. And sometimes it takes a little privilege, I think, to actually make a wood bank go. All right, Eric, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of emphasize the point you were just making, Clarisse, about a wood bank being, you know, it's possible to create a wood bank almost anywhere. And if we look at that map, Fairfax County, Connecticut is actually highlighted. And anyone who knows like the New York City area knows that's a very wealthy, generally wealthy community, very close to several major cities, and yet they have a successful wood bank there. Similarly, we can see several wood banks operating near Boston, and urban sprawl in the Boston area is, you know, pretty gigantic at this point, and housing prices are going way up, 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 and yet there's still a need despite that increased like wealth influx into that area for a wood bank. And so I think the lesson there is wood banks vary not only in what geographic areas they serve. I'm down in North Carolina right now. We have wood banks down here. We're in climate zone 8, and we still have wood banks. And they also serve in communities where you may not expect it. And so kind of what I've been surprised by and learned as I've looked through these interviews that Clarisse conducted is that you can start a wood bank almost anywhere in the US. And I'm kind of assuming that parallels Canada as well. And you could start a wood bank, you know, in the suburbs of Montreal, for example. So, okay, actually, and go ahead, Clarisse, to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what do these wood banks look like? How do they operate? And this is where I want to highlight something that I've started to think about as a wood bank's paradox in my head. And what I mean by that is that you have to be super organized to run a wood bank. I mean, I grew up processing firewood to heat our home with my parents, and I think a lot of people on this call probably knows how much work that takes. You know, you have to find the down tree, you have to get your saw and split it into pieces, you have to split the wood, you have to have a place to put the wood. You have to decide if it's worth it to drag the wood splitter out or if you're going to use the maul out in the forest before you haul it back in. It's very labor intensive, and you have to plan a year ahead. If you wait till October to say, oh, I better get my firewood ready for the season, you're in deep trouble. You don't have any firewood. And so you have to have a plan. And so if you're running a wood bank, you have to account for all of that labor and all of that time. And so you have to be, you know, pretty detail oriented and thinking really ahead of the game here. You have to plan at least a year out to say, I'm going to give firewood to people in need in my community. It's 2022. I want to do that by winter of 2023, so you can let that wood cure. Now, here's where the paradox comes in. Despite that complicated nature of creating firewood and that multi-step iterative process of creating firewood, a lot of these organizations are improvised. A lot of them are just taking advantage of whatever resources are available in their community, who's able to help and who's able to bring them the wood. And so now let me show you some of that with the organizational structure that we have here. I think one thing to know is that wood banks have existed in the United States at least for quite a while. We found an article in the Eugene Register Guard in Eugene, Oregon about a wood bank in the 1970s when I did a newspaper search. And then we saw several other wood banks that Clarisse interviewed started in the 1990s. In the 2000s, we saw a boom, and we're seeing another boom right now in the 2010s. We saw another boom in the 2010s. And so these wood banks are popping up everywhere, and they've been around for quite a while. Go ahead. Yeah. The other thing to know is that one way that you kind of offset that need for organization is that a lot of these wood banks kind of are attached to another organization, which then helps them start to plan things out. It helps them to get all of their resources together. Now you'll see 57% of the wood banks that we interviewed were an extension of an existing organization. Often that means the local church. A lot of these were church-based initiatives. They called them ministries. And so a lot of that 57% is people who are working with their faith community to get firewood for the rest of the community. As they grow in size, though, we saw some actually pursued what we say in the U.S. 501c3 status, which is an independent nonprofit status in the United States. And so some of those organizations that actually registered, and then some were part of the local government. And so some of them were, there was part of the municipality had some resources to distribute firewood, and so the wood bank is run out of actually a government office. And so there's a wide range of attachments for these wood banks, but I think the key here is that they're rarely totally standalone organizations. They're just doing wood banking by themselves. They're often part of a bigger group, especially as they start out. And the other thing to know is that they service a wide range of areas. So some of them are just servicing a single town. Maybe it's a very, very isolated area, and so it would take a long time to truck wood, from 30, 40 miles to the next town over. Whereas others are serving entire counties, others are serving a multi-town radius, and some of them are serving across multiple counties. I'm guessing that's probably more likely in the New England area, where a lot of our counties are incredibly small, unnecessarily small. The point I want to drive home here, though, is that there's a number of ways that wood banks choose to affiliate themselves, and then they send wood out long distances sometimes, and sometimes they only serve nearby and everything in between. Next slide, please. The ways in which wood banks distribute the wood also differs pretty significantly. And this gets back to that improvised nature of the wood bank. If you have, as Clarisse was showing in those slides, if you have some people who are just more or less saying, all right, you know what, we're going to get together, we're going to organize, and we're going to distribute the wood as best we can, one of the things that's more difficult to figure out is a distribution model. And so a lot of places will actually just have a pickup day. They'll say, if you are in the area and you need firewood, come to the local volunteer fire department. We have the wood on a lawn under a tarp behind or a field behind the fire department. Stop by and pick up what you need. You got to put it in your own truck, though. And then as they grow, some others will start to be able to deliver firewood as well. So they'll actually have people often volunteer their own pickup trucks, but a few actually had their own vehicles as they started to grow. And so usually they'll start out by just advertising and saying, if you're in need, we have wood here. And then as they get bigger, they'll start to actually take it out to people who may be in need. And if you look at that first bullet point, I want to highlight that first bullet point because the range of wood distributed from the people we interviewed is massive. The smaller range is 6.5 cord per year, and it was going up to over 250. And I'm assuming some of those organizations continue to grow and are distributing even more now. And so we really have just what amounts to a few trees to 250 cord, which is quite impressive. Next slide, please. And this is where we get into eligibility. So who is eligible? So you send out a call and you say, all right, we have wood to distribute. Let us know if you need it. And one way that wood banks identify people who need wood is that they will partner with other community assistance programs, such as food banks, that identify households in need. Maybe they'll share a mailing list. Maybe they'll contact people directly. Maybe they'll ask the food bank, where's the best place for us to advertise for this? And you can think of this as kind of a supplemental form of, food stamps in the U.S. or of a food bank, where you're saying, okay, these people need help with food. We don't want them choosing between food or firewood. We don't want them saying, okay, I can only afford food today, so I'm going to go buy firewood, or I can only afford to heat my house today, so I'm not going to buy food. We want them to have access to both of those things. And so working with the food banks will help identify people or individuals in your community who are in need. And that's also, I think, why a lot of the wood banks probably start in church communities as well, because those communities do tend to reach out and find those people in need in the area. There is sometimes an eligibility system, but for the most part, most of the organizations that Clarisse interviewed work with an honor system, where they say, all right, if you need firewood, stop by. We're not going to vet it. We're not going to check to see what your income is, or if you're actually out of wood or whatever. Just take what you need today, and then we'll figure it out from there. The other thing here is that you don't have to have a ton of wood to start a wood bank. Most of these wood banks are not intending to supply people with their entire season's worth of wood. They're saying, okay, you're a little short right now. Maybe it was a bad season. Maybe you didn't get all the firewood processed that you needed. Maybe something happened to your supply. Maybe there was a big storm. We're going to help you out and get through this rough patch until you can get some more wood from another source. Maybe you ran out of heating oil and you can't afford more, so you're going to use firewood for a few weeks. You stop by the wood bank and say, geez, I just need some firewood until I get my tax return back so that I can buy some more heating oil. Can I have some? And you say yes. Next slide, please. Yeah, and there's it looks like a voucher for 1 pallet of wood, and that gets into the ways in which the wood is quantified. It's often, kind of camping honor system style. You pay $5 and take an armful of wood to your campfire. Similar here, where instead of that, you say, all right, I got a pickup. I'm going to fill up my pickup, or I'm going to use it, or they put them on pallets and say you can take 1 pallet, fill up your truck with the 1 pallet. And so there's not often true measuring. And so who are these people who are accessing wood banks? And this was very interesting to me. I went into the interviews that Clarisse used, and I started to look to see what's going on with people. Why are they needing this firewood? And there are 4 central themes that predicted if someone needed firewood. Number 1 was poverty. We already talked about this. You can imagine if you're living in poverty and you're choosing how to spend your money, it often gets difficult to buy firewood, especially later in the season if demand starts to increase and maybe the prices start to creep up a little bit. So people who are experiencing poverty have a harder time affording firewood. Similarly, we found that people with medical issues were having a hard time. And so again, this could be anything from chronic illness to someone had a surgery and they broke their leg and they can't do manual labor for the summer. And now they couldn't in the summer they couldn't process their firewood. Now it's winter and they're out of luck. What do? It could also be older people who are having chronic medical issues, who are no longer able to handle their own firewood, but could come by and pick it up. And so medical issues covers both chronic and acute conditions. Lastly, we saw people who needed firewood for emergency circumstances, and this often falls into the category of a difficult winter, for example. So if there's an extreme weather event, maybe maybe it's snowing and it's April 7th in New England. That's not quite usual Massachusetts. It's still, within the range of possibility, but it's a little later in the year. So what am I going to do? I still need firewood, and I didn't expect it to still be cold in mid-April. You go to the wood bank, and they help take care of you during those extreme weather events. Same thing. Maybe heating prices are going up. We're seeing the price of crude oil is going way up. So I'd imagine heating costs for people who rely on different types of fuel is going to go up, and that may make them fall back to their backup plan, fall back to that trusty wood stove down in the basement. And so then they may need wood unexpectedly. Lastly, the big factor that covered all of these, that intersected with all of this, was elderly. People who were elderly were more likely to access a wood bank based on the interviews that Clarisse did. And again, you can see how all of these issues come together and really affect our older neighbors. Older people often live on fixed incomes, so they're more likely to be living in poverty. Older people, by nature of getting old, start to experience more medical issues. It's no fun being 75 years old and trying to cut down a tree and take it over to the splitter. So what we see there is that being elderly intersects with all of these to create vulnerability to fuel poverty. And if you look at my fancy little Venn diagram over here, what I'm trying to highlight is that it was pretty rare in these interviews that someone said, hey, only one thing is the reason why people come to take take our firewood. You see, only one person said emergency need alone was a precipitating factor to accessing wood banks. Only one person said medical issues were a precipitating need. And so what you see here is multiple vulnerabilities intersecting: medical needs, age, bad weather. They all intersect to create a need for firewood for these people. And that can tell us more about why people need firewood, might allow us to predict when people are going to need firewood. For example, a lot of communities in the United States starting to get older. You could maybe look at a census record and see, oh geez, the average age here went up 15 years in the last, since the last census. This is going to be an area where we probably need a wood bank sooner rather than later. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. 15 of 21 interviews described overlapping categories of need. So that just gets to what I was speaking about a minute ago, where nearly 75% of the interviews we did, people said there's multiple reasons why someone is coming to take firewood. So just to give you an example, I pulled some quotes from the interviews that Clarisse did to show everyone what's going on and show the kind of the desperation that people are living in at times when they're looking for this firewood. So wood bank recipients often live in desperation. Many subsist on fixed incomes, struggling to meet basic needs, and sometimes necessitating trade-offs between food, heat, or medicine. Could I get those quotes, please? So here's a quote from an interview. All of our deliveries have at one time or another delivered to somebody who had like just busted up an old chair or a scrap pallet because they didn't have anything else to burn. Or they had all their burners on their stove and their stove turned on and the oven open. Now think about just like the safety risk there alone. You're pulling cabinets off your wall and burning them inside your house. What kind of paint is on those cabinets? What kind of finish has been put on those cabinets? What kind of plastic is in a handle or something, and you're starting to burn that? Not ideal, not great. Similarly, we don't want people turning on their oven and just leaving it on for heat. Huge fire risk. And so we're seeing how poverty creates desperation, and then desperation has a ripple effect where it can have pretty substantial impacts on people's lives. And something as simple as just finding some down firewood from the electric company cut some limbs off, and we're able to give it to people, that can make a big difference in their lives. And here's the quote that I pulled from and here's the quote that I think drives the point home most pithily, and it is, they have to decide, gee, do I put food on the table, do I buy medicine, or do I heat my home? And that's where you can see that idea of like working with maybe a local pharmacist to say, hey, who's in need around here? Or working with a wood bank to identify people in need can be very handy. Next slide, please. So medical issues, as we talked about, processing firewood is very difficult. So here is a quote about two older sisters, I think. Yeah. Oh no, we're not there yet. I have one where the husband's legally blind and the wife has lost 2 legs to diabetes, and they're scraping by on Social Security. So the need is deep and legitimate. And this is where it gets a little more away from that emergency situation and into you're trying to help people for the full year, which requires a little more infrastructure. I got a wonderful thank you note the other day from a recipient. It was really touching. It's a woman whose husband was in a car accident and experienced some pretty significant brain damage. And I mean, she's just so appreciative. So again, something very tragic happened in someone's life, and the wood bank's making it so they don't have to worry about heat. And so here we have a quote about being caught short unexpectedly. This is a family who's a household who's maybe normally able to handle their own needs, but today can't. And so the quote is, we distributed 26 cords this past winter and 30 cords the winter before when it was a colder winter. There might be some recipients where we give them 1 truckload and that's all they need because they're getting over a hump until they get their tax refund. Another quote, a lot of people have wood as a backup. When oil was so expensive, they would burn the wood, just a little bit of oil, just a little bit of wood, milk it back and forth and make it go. So these aren't people who only use firewood in their homes. It's at times people who have you have multiple sources. Next slide. And the last one, all of the interviews mentioned the elderly as a key factor here. A lot of older people, the people are older people, so there's no way they can come pick it up and take care of it themselves. A lot of them are lower income with fixed income. That's what they've got. So we have to provide for them. So we're seeing why sometimes a distribution model is necessary. Some people may not have an appropriate vehicle. Here's one over here. Apparently they had like this 1972 Bonneville, with a trunk that you could live in. There were 2 sisters. They both lost their husbands. The one sister moved in with another, and she had an old wood stove in the kitchen. You can start to see here why some of these larger wood banks will start to distribute the wood, because for some people, especially older people, doing any amount of manual labor can be difficult. And so some of those wood banks are saying, geez, we're getting big enough that we can actually maybe afford to drive it out to the people who really need it. And so those are the reasons why people are accessing wood banks. My takeaway here is that many households live on a proverbial razor's edge, in which one unexpected setback can force them to choose between food, medicine, or heat. Because it's providing a vital community service, wood bank operations shouldn't be ad hoc, even though they are at times right now. Wood banks rely on volunteers and partnerships and never operate in isolation. So what I want to point out here is that there are lots of people in need in these communities, and the volunteers and this wide range of varying levels of organization often figure out ways to meet their needs. And we're hoping that this presentation with the handouts is able to teach some of you all how you could start your own wood bank. So I'm going to hand off now to Dr. Harper. Rick, you want to give us some takeaways at the end?
Sure. So we've all been thinking about some of the actual kind of practical applications related to wood banks, and I'm just going to piggyback on what Clarisse was mentioning at the beginning in terms of our conversation at Bertucci's. This is all very relevant to me. We teach something in human dimensions, and I teach human dimensions of natural resources. It's referred to as the direct experience principle. And so somebody can show you a study, somebody can show you a public opinion poll, but what is primacy are your own experiences. And so having grown up on a farm where we lived below the poverty line, we heated with wood because it was necessary. This is all very meaningful to me. My first employment in the urban forestry arboriculture world was working as an arborist, a field arborist. I came to the US to do that after I finished at Lakehead. And the number one question that we get at the beginning of the day before we headed out to a job site was, where do we dump at the end of the day? So a big part of this in terms of what we're talking about today has also got very real application to folks in the arboriculture and urban forestry world. And part of that, of course, is looking at how do we turn something that, again, where the conversation is how do we quote unquote dump something that we need to get rid of into a resource, and not just a resource writ large, but a resource where people actually can use this resource. So of course we have questions and thoughts about climate change in terms of weather, erratic weather, and Eric had mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when we think about things like early freezes or late frosts, erratic weather patterns where people might need to use firewood at different times of the year that may not necessarily be traditional, we're expecting the frequency and the severity of storms to increase. And so that means that we're going to see in the future perhaps more downed trees, more downed wood and biomass from at the municipal level. What do we do with that material? Where, again, that question, where do we dump this material? Wood banks present one small but I think significant part of the solution to this problem. I think that's part of an underlying theme to what Clarisse and Eric and I are talking about, and that is that there's great integration with this work. Again, when we're talking about climate change, people are thinking about perhaps increased growing season, shorter winters, less snowpack, and people might think, well, how does that relate to the need for wood? Well, I already mentioned erratic weather patterns, but when we think about things like insects and insect populations, what do we have with longer growing seasons? Well, we have more generations of those insects. We have higher fecundity and populations. And so you can have more insect predation related to urban trees. And again, we need to deal with this biomass that something like an emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle is going to generate at the community level. And additionally, we also know, again, one of sort of the through lines related to sort of mitigating invasive insects and invasive pests is to preclude individuals from moving firewood, especially moving at great distances. We know that a substantial number of pests are moved because campers and other well-intentioned individuals move firewood great distances. So the local use of wood is critical. And again, wood banks can be an important part of that picture as well. So I think that this idea of integration, this idea of local use really sort of undercuts a lot of these information, a lot of what we're talking about today. And then of course, when we're talking about arboriculture and urban forestry, the use of wood, invariably safety comes up, and you know, the use of wood and the use of wood in terms of how clean or how dirty is it in terms of a source of energy. Well, there are certain best practices that we can implement, like making sure that your wood's cured, making sure your wood is dried at the time of burning. Eric mentioned earlier, we don't start thinking about our firewood. We didn't start thinking about our firewood on a farm in Canada late in the summer. You're thinking about things hopefully a year in advance. So there are certain basic protocols that, again, I think take a picture that we initially might think is very simplistic and helps us understand how nuanced and how complex this issue is, and all the different variables and all the different partners involved with this issue of wood banks and community wood usage. So I think that's it on our end, correct, Clarisse and Eric?
Yeah, I was just going to close. I was just going
Excellent.
to close with this last resource slide. So doing a couple of wood bank talks, and there's always the question, how can I start or maybe contribute to a wood bank? So I'm going to link to Dr. Leahy's wonderful guide. And just to think about, like, I really urge you to think about a wood bank, that whole kind of supply, processing, distribution arc. There are so many ways to get involved. Maybe you can really help out with the supply side. You can make those logs available. Maybe you're a sawyer, maybe you can buck wood, so you can be part of the processing. Maybe you have an area of land that could be sort of the wood yard. Maybe you have a big storage container where like the equipment can go. I'm just thinking of all the needs that we've run into in our own wood bank. And then distribution, actually back to the processing, there are people, there are 95-year-olds, there are actually wood bank recipients who really help on the wood processing volunteer days. They will come and bring coffee, or they'll come and bring muffins, or they'll just like come and sit in a chair and like tell stories and kind of keep everyone's spirits up while we're cutting wood. So it really can be like a real community effort, and it takes everyone. And then the distribution part, if you have a pickup truck, if you have a little posse of students or your own kids who might want to help stack wood or deliver wood, it's all needed. So you can also, in terms of thinking about more info about this research, you are welcome to email any of us. I didn't throw Jay on here because he's not here and I didn't volunteer him, but you're welcome to email us about the research. And if you're interested in just thinking bigger picture about wood banks, at least at the US level, Rick and I are working with Jess Leahy and Sean Mahoney and the Alliance for Green Heat and the USDA to organize a wood bank summit for US folks, at least, to think about how some federal money might be distributed, and to just sort of get everybody together in a virtual room and not reinventing the wheel, and really talking about some of these shared issues. So certainly feel free to email me if you're interested in being on the email list for that summit. We would love to have you. And now I think we are ready to open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
I think you're on mute there, Alex.
Fantastic. Thank you for the questions here.
Sorry, everyone. I think Alex is just having a bit of audio issues, but I'll just get us started and then Alex will jump back in. So one of the first questions that we got in the chat here was, is owning or affording a wood burning stove or fireplace a limiting factor?
So I can, I'll jump in if I understand the right. So the reason, so Clarisse talked a little bit about naturally resource dependent areas of Canada and the United States at the beginning of the presentation. And one thing that we've read about in the academic literature is that, and that we have some practical experience with the team as well, is that converting people in those natural resource dependent areas from wood heat to other types of heating is often cost prohibitive and logistically prohibitive. And so the reason why we're saying these wood banks are preferable, possibly in some cases, to converting households to different forms of heat is because converting to other forms of heat is not practical for a lot of areas, but it is practical, to follow the utility truck around and grab the trees they cut down. Do you guys think that answers the question?
It does,
Absolutely.
and it actually leads us a little bit to a policy. I remember digging around for this information, Eric. We're going back a little bit here in terms of time, but this also gets into like buyback programs where here in the U.S., federally speaking, at least whenever I was looking at the information, again, we're going back a little bit, but there's no national sort of buyback program. If somebody wants to get out of the cycle of a really inefficient heating unit in their house, really inefficient firewood, wood stove, there's no buyback program. There are those programs at the local level. So that's a really important paradox and a really important question. How efficient is the heating unit in your house, and how do you actually sort of upgrade that? Again, dealing with individuals that don't typically have a lot of resources. So that's something from a policy level. I'm sort of excited, like Clarisse said, to be working with some of the folks at the federal level here.
Perfect. I think Alex is back. Do you want to try and jump on, Alex?
Does that work? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous.
Yeah, awesome.
So Eric asks, who are the decision makers at the municipal level?
That's a
Clarisse, I
good
think
question.
yeah.
Yeah. So I would say it varies. So sometimes it's at sort of the highway department and facilities, kind of tree, like infrastructure type people who are running it. That's the case in the town adjacent to us. But other times it's like a municipal committee, which is the case in my town. So it's an all volunteer. Every town in Massachusetts has a forest and shade tree committee. So we're sort of the governing body. The chairs are, technically town sort of employees, although we're unpaid.
Yeah, I've mentioned before, we're very fortunate here to have tree wardens in Massachusetts and New England. They're essentially legislated urban foresters. So whenever Clarisse was mentioning Melissa Lavangie, Melissa is the tree warden in Petersam. So buy-in from those local decision makers is critical, and that tree warden is a very influential individual. The influence and the authority of that individual exceeds that of a typical city forester.
Thank you. A question from Joe. At the beginning of the webinar, you mentioned Indigenous people. Are there any specific wood bank programs that are focused or located on tribal lands?
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you for asking that question. So that was complicated for me when I was doing the initial search. They didn't come up in the web search, but now they do. And I have learned just a lot more about Indigenous communities, and I work closely with Indigenous communities now, and I know the different things that you can search for, like it's different words. So a lot of times within tribal communities, it's firewood for elders. And so it'll be, called senior wood or wood for seniors, something like that. And so the self-determination of Indigenous communities and being able to support that is really, really important to me, especially as we start to think about how are we distributing federal dollars. Maybe the tribes aren't federally recognized. So there's just a lot of questions there, but I think tribes have a lot of experience in living in community and thinking about supporting their people and their elders. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from how those, they may not be called wood banks, but how those sort of wood access programs for seniors have been operating for a long time in tribal communities. And then the National Forest Service in the US has been partnering with the Navajo Nation and other nations to take like wood from fire mitigation efforts and make sure that it gets to tribal communities. So there's sort of different like within tribe and then like partnership ways that this has been happening.
I think that program's called Wood for Life, isn't it, Clarisse?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's non-merchantable timber that comes from all sorts of harvests and all sorts of forced operations that is then moved to actually Indigenous tribes and for their usage.
Yeah, I think that's with Navajo and Hopi people.
On the topic of more kind of urban wood sourcing, Eric asks the question that lots of local commercial firewood suppliers stay away from residential trees because of hidden metals and potential to damage equipment. How does this look within kind of a wood bank community?
Yeah, others can chime in here, but I'll just say that it's something that we think about a lot here in Petersam because they are street trees that are coming down. And so our sawyers, know the risk, and they also, like the highway department and the utility companies who are dropping off the wood, they are mindful of that as well. So I guess we don't have like a systemic sort of way of ensuring safety, but I know that it's on the minds of every single person who's dealing with these street trees. This is all I can say.
That's also something that can be sort of factored in from just sort of an operational standpoint, is understanding that hitting the occasional, hopefully it's occasional, hitting the occasional nail, whatever piece of metal that's made its way into a tree, you know what? we need to make sure we have extra chains or some funds set aside for chains and bars and those sorts of pieces of equipment that we may damage in the process of processing this urban wood.
Let me also jump in and say something we saw in the interviews relatedly was that some wood banks actually buy wood from local firewood providers. And several interviewees mentioned that they try to maintain a good relationship with the local firewood economy. And so they think very intentionally about not undercutting someone who may make their livelihood off of selling firewood and try to work in collaboration with those people oftentimes instead of against them.
To wrap it up then, because we're a little bit shy on time, but on the topic of risk management, stuff like that, Karen asks the question, how do wood banks handle risk management amongst volunteers, considering the high risk activity that is tree cutting? Is there a special umbrella insurance policies, waivers, or is it simply not worried about?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it works in Canada, but I can tell you that we've thought about this a lot here in Massachusetts. So we make sure that we process the wood on town land, and we make sure that the town is aware of the potential liability there. Although if you're working sort of for charity and if it's on municipal land or even nonprofit land, I think there is like sort of a lessened liability there. But we are very, very safety conscious, and we only have like professional sawyers cutting the wood, and I would say that that's the bottleneck for a lot of wood banks, really having sawyers who can do it safely and have the right PPE and have the right experience, which is how the tree care industry and arborists can really come in and be helpful. But safety is something that came up in all the interviews, and it's, often you'll just have a lot of volunteers just put on stacking, honestly, or maybe operating a splitter, but definitely not doing the work of a sawyer and bucking wood.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for answering those questions. It's almost now it's 1 o'clock. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks everyone for the questions and for the huge attendance to our webinar today. Before we close, there's one question about CEUs. If you're with the ISA, we'll automatically process your CEUs and you'll receive them in your account in the next month or so. A big thank you to Clarisse, Rick, and Eric for joining us today. For folks who are joining us and haven't heard of the Canadian Tree Fund, a very brief overview is that we're a registered charitable organization in Canada. Any donation of $20 or more receives a tax receipt, and all of our funding goes towards student scholarships and research grants in Canadian arboriculture and forestry. I've just pasted the link into the chat there, and we're very thankful for anything that folks can donate. With that, huge support and thanks for tuning in. We appreciate the folks who've come out today to listen in, and to our 3 presenters, and to the ISAO as always for hosting our webinar series. With that, a big thank you, and we'll see you next month for our next presentation. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.